Okay, welcome back everyone to Sip and Talk.
Good to be here.
Today, we're plunging into something that, really caught our eyes. We looked through the information. It's a fascinating look at just how different perspectives can be, even within, one country. We're zooming in on China today. And specifically, we're exploring this contrast between folks living in Shanghai and another group you often hear about called the Little Pinks.
Yeah, and what we're digging into, it comes from a whole collection of research and reports we were given. It offers this really unique window, I think, into how views on big global events, major domestic stuff like the 2022 COVID lockdowns,
right,
and even how people feel about countries like the U.S. can really diverge, sometimes quite sharply.
Exactly. So our goal here, our sort of mission for this deep dive, is to try and unpack why these differences pop up. We want to get a handle on who these groups actually are, look at specific times their views clash based on the info we have, and really try to grasp why understanding these dynamics matters for getting a more, let's say, layered picture of China today.
Yeah, getting beyond the headlines.
It's like trying to find those key insights amidst all the noise.
Exactly. It's not about making it simple, because it's not simple. It's about understanding those undercurrents that create the complexity you see.
Okay, so let's start by understanding the players involved here. First up, you've got residents of Shanghai.
Right.
Now, Shanghai, it immediately makes you think of internationalism, right? It's China's huge global financial center, incredibly connected. People there often have higher education, and this is key, probably more exposure to foreign culture, foreign information than in many other parts of China.
Definitely.
And just looking at the numbers we saw, Shanghai has about, 24.9 million people?
Around that, yeah.
Which sounds massive, and it is, but it's roughly 1.7% of China's total population.
That's the key point.
So yeah, a giant, super important city, but still numerically a pretty small slice of the whole country.
And then you contrast that with this group known as the Little Pinks.
Okay.
Now, these are mostly young Chinese netizens, internet users, known for really strong nationalism.
Yeah.
Like fierce support for the government and its positions, often quite unquestioning support. They're researching some interesting details here. Apparently, around 83% are female, mostly young, aged 18 to 24. And often, they come from smaller cities, third or fourth tier cities, not the big coastal hubs like Shanghai.
That's interesting. So not the big city stereotype necessarily?
Not always, no. And what's really notable is how active they are on global social media places like X, Instagram platforms that are technically blocked in China.
Right, the Great Firewall.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But they find ways, and their online presence is significant, and their views. They consistently strongly mirror the official state narrative.
So just that difference in background, Shanghai's international vibe versus the more nationalist education, smaller city background for many Little Pinks, that seems like a pretty fundamental reason for different viewpoints, doesn't it?
It really does seem foundational. The environment you're in, the information you can access or choose to access, these are powerful shapers of how you see the world.
Makes sense.
Shanghai's setting naturally lends itself to maybe a wider range of information, potentially more critical thinking, whereas the Little Pink demographic seems much more aligned with and active within that sphere, heavily influenced by state media and nationalist feeling.
And this is where it gets really interesting. How do these different viewpoints actually play out when something big happens?
Yeah.
The material we looked at gave us some pretty clear examples where this contrast is really stark. Let's start with the Hong Kong anti-extradition movement back in 2019-2020.
Right, a really major period of unrest in Hong Kong. Now, what the research suggests about Shanghai residents is interesting. It points towards potential private sympathy for some of the protesters' goals, like calls for democracy or more autonomy.
Okay, private sympathy.
Private sympathy, because any public expression of that, extremely limited according to the reports. The pressure was just too high.
What kind of pressure?
Well, things like online harassment, doxing, revealing personal information, sometimes called pink terror, from nationalist netizens, plus, of course, the government's own censorship apparatus. Now, obviously, many in Shanghai were also influenced by the official story coming from Beijing. But some analysis suggests that within that huge majority of mainlanders critical of the protests, maybe 90%, there was likely a minority holding different views. And that minority probably included some Shanghai residents.
So potentially more understanding view, but kept quiet.
Largely suppressed, yeah, due to that external pressure.
So nuanced, maybe privately sympathetic, but basically silenced. Now, the Little Pinks, Their view on Hong Kong must have been, well, the opposite, and probably much louder.
Oh, absolutely. Unequivocally opposed. They were quick to label the protesters things like separatists, traitors. Very, very vocal online.
Right.
Actively attacking anyone who showed support for the protests or even just questioned the official state media narrative. The research flagged examples where they just blindly defended government reports and went after dissenting voices. It showed this complete alignment with the official portrayal.
Wow. It really shows the power of a vocal online group to kind of dominate the public conversation, even if other views are out there privately.
Precisely. The online space becomes this sort of arena where the loudest, most aggressive voices can easily seem like they represent everyone.
Okay, let's shift to something more recent and closer to home for Shanghai residents. That incredibly strict COVID lockdown in 2022. That must have hit everyone there directly.
It did. And the reaction from within Shanghai, based on the research, was really quite different from the dominant national narrative you heard elsewhere.
How so?
There was significant public criticism of the government's measures. And this wasn't necessarily like some big political statement. It was rooted in real, severe, practical hardship.
Like what?
Like critical shortages of food, medicine, basic necessities.
Yeah.
The reports detailed residents openly complaining online, organizing little groups or petitions, sometimes even confronting local officials directly. There was widespread dissatisfaction being expressed.
Okay.
And the research characterized this as, a rational critique. It was driven by the immediate lived experience of serious difficulties.
That seems completely understandable. I mean, if you can't get food or medicine, abstract policy kind of goes out the window, right?
Exactly. Your focus shifts very quickly to survival.
So how did the Little Pinks see all this complaining coming out of Shanghai?
Well, their view tended to align strongly with the official zero-COVID policy. They generally supported the measures, saw them as necessary for the whole country's health.
Right.
So they might have looked at the complaints from Shanghai as maybe selfish or unpatriotic, or like people weren't seeing the bigger picture of controlling the pandemic nationally. They were active online defending the government's policies, often dismissing the criticisms, even those based on genuine hardship in Shanghai, as maybe Western media trying to stir up trouble, or just internal dissent being amplified by, hostile foreign forces.
That's such a stark contrast. One group reacting to their immediate harsh reality, the other interpreting it all through this lens of nationalism and the official line.
It really reveals a fundamental difference in how immediate hardship gets processed and framed, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely. Okay, next up. A topic that's always, always sensitive in China. Taiwan.
Indeed. Hugely sensitive. Core issue. Now, publicly, in Shanghai, like pretty much everywhere else in mainland China, views are shaped by the official One China policy. So the common public stance is support for eventual unification.
Okay, probably.
Publicly. However, because Shanghai is so international, so connected through business, lots of residents have professional or even personal links related to Taiwan. Some might hold more, let's say, pragmatic views privately, maybe more understanding of Taiwan's desire for autonomy or focused on the economic benefits of just keeping things stable, perhaps even neutral views. But, and this is crucial, these private views are very rarely expressed openly. The topic is just too sensitive. Add in the censorship and the pressure from nationalist voices online. Any dissent or even slight nuance tends to get suppressed in public.
Right. And the Little Pinks view on Taiwan, I'm guessing less nuanced.
Much less nuanced.
Yeah.
For Little Pinks, there's really very little gray area here. They are adamantly, unequivocally against any idea of Taiwan independence. Their support for unification is loud and strong. And they seem, perhaps more than other groups, willing to openly discuss or support using force if the government deems it necessary.
And active online about it.
Very active, countering any pro-Taiwan independence comments, attacking figures they see as problematic. The research specifically mentioned those online attacks against the Taiwanese singer Zhao Zuju back in 2016 as a kind of classic example of this nationalist backlash.
So we see that pattern again? Potentially more complex, maybe pragmatic private views in Shanghai, kept quiet, versus the loud, nationalistic, less nuanced stance of the Little Pinks really dominating the public online discussion.
Exactly. It just underscores that what you see most easily isn't always the full picture or the only perspective that exists.
Okay, let's switch gears a bit. Another area where the research showed differences. How people view the United States.
Yeah, this is really interesting. The Shanghai perspective on the U.S. seems quite layered, which, again, kind of makes sense given the city's international nature.
Layered.
Well, on one hand, there's generally a positive impression. They often see the U.S. as, developed, technologically advanced, valuing freedom by UT. They also have some pretty specific criticisms or points of confusion about American society.
Oh, what?
The research specifically mentioned concerns about gun violence, the idea that streets might not be safe at night, a view of U.S. politics as overly complex, maybe too litigious with older politicians, and also what they perceive as excessive political correctness.
Excessive political correctness. What examples did they give?
Things like discussions around numerous genders, the research mentioned, figures like 100 or 200 genders being cited with confusion or criticism, perceived privileges for minorities, and even casting choices in Western movies or plays, like diverse actors in traditionally white roles like Juliet, which some felt was uniquely American and maybe a bit too much.
Wow, that's a fascinatingly specific set of criticisms. It makes you wonder, where are they getting this info if it's not all just state media talking points?
That's a really key point the research brought out. Shanghai residents seem to have this significant awareness that, hey, both Chinese and Western media can be biased or censored.
Okay.
The reports indicate many use VPNs to get around the Great Firewall, accessing platforms like YouTube, even though it's technically illegal.
So often not enforced for personal use, right?
Often not, yeah. It allows access to a much wider range of international content. And their approach seems to be check multiple sources. You get a better picture that way. This critical approach to information seems really linked to higher education levels and that international environment in Shanghai.
That definitely explains a more nuanced view. What about U.S.-China relations? From their perspective, do they worry about trade wars and things like that?
Interestingly, the research suggests many in Shanghai are less caught up in the big government-level conflicts. They often see U.S. actions, like the push to ban TikTok, as mainly political moves, maybe aimed at creating an enemy image of China for domestic votes back in the U.S., perhaps targeting older voters who aren't as tech-savvy. Their general hope for the relationship seems to be more about peaceful coexistence. There's this belief, often summed up as unity makes strength.
Sounds more pragmatic, less ideological, maybe driven by Shanghai's deep economic ties to the world.
That could definitely play a big role. And even culturally, the research noted, Shanghai residents often prefer Hollywood movies. They find Chinese films maybe too creatively restricted. They see things like McDonald's as successful cultural invasion. The research even flagged a potential contradiction. Some residents apparently mistakenly think U.S. delivery drivers make tons of money from tips, while also holding on to a general belief in the American dream. It shows this mix of observation, maybe some misinformation, and cultural ideas all bundled together.
A really complex picture of the U.S. from Shanghai. How does that compare to the Little Pink's view?
Generally much more negative and less complex. The Little Pinks often frame the U.S. as a hegemon, an interfering power. There's a strong theme of asserting China's superiority. The research suggested that nationalism and negative views of the U.S. actually increased partly due to dissatisfaction with how the U.S. handled COVID, alongside a broader rise in online nationalism. They're very active online, criticizing U.S. policies.
And presumably getting their info more from official channels.
It seems likely their views are more directly shaped by official state media narratives and that whole nationalist online ecosystem, leading to a generally less nuanced perspective compared to what we see described in Shanghai.
So summing up the U.S. view, Shanghai's is layered, appreciating some things, criticizing others, using different info sources. Little Pink's view, generally more negative, aligns with the national narrative, probably shaped more by official media. The difference is really striking.
It really is. A clear example of how your environment and your information diet can shape fundamental beliefs about other nations.
Which brings us back to that statistic from the start, Shanghai being about 1.7% of China's population. Given everything we've discussed, does that mean Shanghai's views, the ones we've outlined, are they a significant national viewpoint? Or are they more of a minority voice in the grand scheme of things?
Yeah, based on the population data and the descriptions of these groups, it seems pretty clear that while Shanghai represents a really important, educated, internationally connected urban segment, their views probably don't represent the majority across the entire country.
Right.
China's vast. You have huge populations in rural areas and smaller cities where international exposure is much lower, and the influence of nationalistic education and state media is likely much stronger, much more dominant.
So the Little Pinks, even if they're a specific demographic, might represent a more widespread type of sentiment.
It seems that way. They appear to embody a more prevalent stream of strong nationalistic feeling, especially when you look at what's visible online. That perspective seems much more widespread than the more nuanced views often found in Shanghai.
So the Shanghai viewpoint is crucial for understanding the diversity within China, especially among the urban, educated class.
Absolutely.
But it's likely a minority voice nationally. And maybe more importantly, as we saw again and again, those nuanced Shanghai views often get suppressed or are only shared privately. Meanwhile, the little pink perspective is super visible, very loud, especially online.
That dynamic itself, what gets amplified versus what gets quieted, is a critical piece of the puzzle if you want to understand Chinese public opinion beyond just the surface level.
This whole deep dive really just underscores how incredibly complex the landscape of opinion can be, even inside one country.
It really does. We've seen how Shanghai's unique environment seems to foster a more nuanced, sometimes critical perspective, standing in contrast to that really strong vocal nationalism of the Little Pinks.
And that point about suppression versus visibility feels key. While the Shanghai views might seem, more rational or open-minded on some issues, they're often harder to actually see or hear in the public square. While the Little Pink perspective gets amplified, especially in those online spaces, it's a huge reminder that the loudest voice isn't always the only voice, or even the most representative one.
And maybe that leaves us, and you listening, with something to think about.
Yeah.
Given this pressure, this censorship we've discussed, where certain viewpoints are less visible, maybe even actively suppressed, what's the impact of that? Not just inside China, on how people understand each other, but also externally. How does it shape the way the rest of the world sees the country when only certain voices are easily heard? What gets lost when that happens?
Definitely something to chew on. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive, trying to get a better handle on these different perspectives.
Always interesting.
Keep exploring, keep thinking critically about the information you come across. And we'll catch you next time.
I just want to give another shout out to Micky from Mickytolife. His channel is a treasure trove of inspiration, and he's a huge Sip&Talk fan.
Absolutely. Make sure to check him out and maybe even share your awesome podcast intro with him once you've created it.